Good afternoon. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. Here's my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
So what's up?
It's good. Well, another Big Brother story. This one comes from Texas and the Washington Post
hmm
going abusive.
What's the
You want to pick
Washington
it up?
Post doing? It looks like, from what I saw, that are they colluding with the Chinese in this effort, Dave? What's going on there?
No, it's the other way around. They're acting like the Chinese. Remember,
Okay.
China does have the most effective surveillance program in the world.
hmm
Uh, that's no excuse for what's happening in America. Uh, the the story in the Washington Post was excellently reported. It appears that when Xi went to uh, California for a conference,
Xi being the leader of China.
yep,
hmm
the Chinese embassy organized massive, sometimes violent protests against him, mostly featuring people, Chinese people who lived in America and were sympathetic with what was happening in their home country.
hmm
Big story. The embassy, they had pretty good evidence the embassy was directly involved. And as you can imagine, this is something that America does all the time,
Okay, wait,
which
David. I'm,
means
I'm a little confused. Who was demonstrating? Okay, Xi, the premier of China, was visiting. The embassy
there
was
were
involved with
the
the embassy.
demonstrators against them, and
Okay,
the embassy organized counter demonstrators.
I see. Okay. hmm
Uh,
And
and
and meanwhile, there's a bunch of surveillance going on.
well, the Washington Post, the reporters on it for 6 months.
hmm
This is the kind of thing very few newspapers can do anymore. Not that that many ever did it before, but it's harder and harder to get investigative reporting funded.
hmm
Uh, got a lot of footage, mostly from people's cell phone cameras, like I'm talking to you on,
hmm
from the event. And how did they figure out who was in the counter demonstration group? They used facial recognition, the kind of thing that folks like us are saying the police should not be using.
hmm
But the Washington Post just went right ahead and did it.
hmm So the Washington Post did the data collection.
The Washington Post
hmm
took the film that they got, the video they got, and used facial recognition on it. I almost couldn't believe it. It was buried in the story.
hmm
The story was brilliantly reported. They had loads and loads of facts,
hmm
presented well. But when I saw that they had identified people with software that, among other things, Facebook paid a huge penalty to Illinois for using. And there was a new one, Clearview, the most obnoxious
hmm
outfit on the web that scraped 3 billion pictures from the web so it can identify half the people on Earth if the police or the government wants them to. Got a $30 million fine from the Dutch government because
Slap
that
on the
was
wrist. Slap on the wrist. But Dave, now break down for me what was the Post's motivation in collecting this data? I'm I'm a little lost at what where were they
they
going with
wanted
it?
to know who was demonstrating. They
Okay, they
did
just
six,
investigated who's out there.
yeah, they did
Mhm.
6 months of work investigating every way they can. 35 interviews. The reporter said, uh, lots and lots of documents, etc. And they watched a lot of video that was shot at the event and used facial recognition to figure out who was in that video.
Mhm.
And they found a lot of people who, when they researched them, were known for connections to China. They were active in Chinese supporting organizations, and they're as ooh, did you hear that?
Yeah, that was good. My phone is talking back to me.
Ah, okay. So I
So the Post identified people who were pro-China, anti-China. I mean, what was their
this was
angle?
pro-China. That was what the article was about.
Okay, okay.
The police was certainly there
Mm-hmm.
taking photos of everybody who was anti-China. And well, let's go to the other story that's going.
Okay, well,
Texas.
before we go, what did the Post do with this information, Dave? Did they share with the Chinese government? They just shared it with their story. This is just part of their
They
investigative
just used
reporting, or
it to
what?
report their reporting.
Just doing the reporting. Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, of course, that means that the National Security Agency probably got all the primary data. Because in the United
Dave,
States,
give a time out for 1 second. 1 second. Give me just a minute. Okay, sorry about that. Okay,
no
so
problem.
there's a story coming out of Texas about the Texas Department of Public Safety spending some $5.3 million on buying a 5-year plan, some controversial surveillance tool called Tangles. Uh, and David, apparently an AI-powered web platform that scrapes information from the open net, from the open, deep, and dark web. So I guess it's scraping everything off the web. And it's got some a premier add-on that, for a couple of extra bucks. Uh, it enables folks to track people's mobile devices, um, movements in a particular area. Essentially, geofencing is something we've talked about before on the show, which a number of legislators, the Fifth Circuit Court in particular, held that police cannot compel Google and others to provide that data. They have been doing
But
that.
they mostly do it anyway.
Yeah, well, it sounds like here's now a private company with a private product that you can just go buy off the shelf and collect the data. And the Texas Department of Public Safety is doing just that.
What I was waiting for was somebody in Texas to say, you shouldn't object to this. They do even worse in China.
Really?
Which is true. The
Mm-hmm.
Chinese surveillance is much more complete and much more effective. But the Americans are coming up with techniques that are awfully close. The
Mm-hmm.
latest technical achievement is an outfit designed to, well, put in the Times Square subway station, identifying 100 people at the same time going through the station to see who was there and who was doing what. Using facial recognition, that's how good it gets. That one hasn't been deployed as far as I know, but they're out there looking for customers from police departments and, of course, the government surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
Big
And,
Brother is working around the world.
mm-hmm.
We don't do it as well as the Chinese or as thoroughly as the Chinese, but we sure and heck do it here in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. And, of course, they say, well, we're not collecting any personal data. We're just collecting impersonal data, users in this location, that location. But as this story talked about this, it's so easy to cross-reference the data that's collected with other data and come up with very personal data profiles of who, and where. Addresses and where people live and stuff like that. So, I think you're right, Dave. It's becoming a total surveillance global situation is evolving to that. You got China, you got the U.S., and I'm sure it's happening in other developed areas as well. We know big
Not
surveillance
just,
in,
not
in,
just,
in Great Britain.
not just developed areas.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, right? We're in a Cold War with China. we have, I don't know how large a force in Washington whose job is to spread negative stories about China, which is what secret agencies usually do. It was it was what the Germans did on the British in World War II, and the British did on the Germans in World War II. And nothing has changed except the methods have gotten more efficient.
So I mean, you mentioned China. We're talking about China, how sophisticated they are. I want to segue for a second to we're talking about free speech and Brazil and Musk. There's a big story going on down there related to the premier of Brazil, who was in a feud with Elon Musk. Something we've talked about on the show over the last, I don't know how long, free speech. Dave?
In both Brazil and in France,
Really?
it's the prosecutors who have much more authority than in the United States, active. In fact, in France, although Macron supported his prosecutors, when you looked at the stories, it looked like they were acting on their own.
Now, France are the folks that just went after the Telegram guy, right? They just arrested him last week. We talked about. Okay.
Yep. And Musk's attack on Brazil is among the judges of the Supreme Court who was leading the charge against hate speech and political propaganda on Twitter. Lots of questions come up on that. There's a whole big thing. For I don't know how many years, we've been working with the question of what should be done about hate speech.
Yeah.
And I know that you feel it must be done. And I look at it and say, I don't know what must be done, but I'm not a First Amendment absolutist anymore.
Yeah. I mean, how can you be, Dave, when you got so much inflammatory speech and the platforms are so global and intrusive? We talked about this last week a little bit. You in a crowded theater, you yell fire. I mean, I think that's prosecutable. Now, if you're on the internet and you're inflaming folks to violence, to me, that's prosecutable as well. I guess there's a fine line as, how do you define what's inflamed? But, I think, in my mind, I think, something has to be done. I think there's got to be some sort of guardrails put up there. Otherwise, you're going to have people like Musk, the richest man in the world, with that huge platform of his. X used to be Twitter. And he's letting all kind of hate speech on that platform. And the guy in Brazil is fighting, and I think he's made a good case. Musk said he's ready to go into a ring to duke it out with this guy. I think that's a little bit of grandstanding on his part, but Musk is trying to make a stand, and he's trying to prove a point. And if he's able to overcome this guy in Brazil, I don't know that anybody's going to slow him down. Not that the guy in Brazil could slow him down, even though there's some 200 million people that day, I think, or so. So it could have an impact on him, but that's just one country on the globe.
This is one of the huge questions on the internet. Should the U.S. internet giants, I'm being frank, it's not any company that you're worried about. It's not even the Chinese who don't get involved in this kind of thing. It's 5 huge American companies with trillions of dollars dominating the internet. And should they answer to governments? Should they pay taxes? That's been a big fight between France and the EU against Google and especially Apple, who have been dodging taxes. Should they be responsible for what people say on their platform, at least responsible enough that it's part of their job to try to control it and check it and put up guardrails.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the US, we're not enforcing things like that. In Britain, they're enforcing things like, which has much stronger libel laws. They're enforcing things like that in one key case. There were violent riots across Britain, so violent and so strong that Elon Musk happened to say they're going to have a civil war. It's already
No, I didn't
started.
say it. I think he said it was inevitable and, carry on with the
Well,
incendiary speech. I mean, talk about inflammatory.
I don't know whether he said carry on, but a whole lot of people did say that,
Mm-hmm.
did inspire people to an active, violent action. And the English were really upset because the apparent leader of the far right parties there, who were in the middle of this, happened to be in France when he was saying it,
Mm-hmm.
which meant the English couldn't just go and stop him.
Mm-hmm. And for some of our listeners who may not have been tuned in last week, we talked about this. A um, an inflammatory tweet that went out there about a stabbing that happened in a school. Some kids were killed, young kids were killed, and the tweet, I won't say mistakenly, but mistakenly on purpose, identified the perpetrator as an immigrant, as a Muslim immigrant, and that sparked riots throughout the whole country. And even though the government came out and actually identify the person as a born and raised British citizen, that did nothing to quell the riots or the far right hate that erupted as a result of that misinformation that went out there.
Let's bring it back home because it's an active issue in the American Congress right now. During COVID, there was one point of view that came from almost all the scientists and almost all the senior medical people. It said that COVID was a virus that had to be contained, that the ways to do it were maintain distance, put on masks, and get vaccinated, all of which I did, and I think was right. Many, many people, including the governor of Texas and the then president of the United States, or the past president of the United States at that point, disagreed. He called it the Chinese flu and said it's not very serious problem. Well, 1 million people dying, which happened in the United States, sounds pretty serious to me. Now, when you have these stuff that persuades people not to take the recommended actions, notably including the vaccine, should the government try to discourage it? Well, I would certainly, if I were the Surgeon General of the United States, try to discourage misinformation.
Well, they actually did that, Dave, but then you got the president of the United States at the time that was pushing back on him. I mean, that was a pretty incredible situation.
Well, the news on this is when we got a different president who gave the authority to his Surgeon General and to his top medical people to get the word out of what was going on as best they understood it. And there's another piece to this story I'll get to in a moment. According to Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, some of them push Facebook to shut down the accounts of people who were disagreeing strongly
Mm-hmm.
and advising people to ignore the medical advice. Is that right or wrong? Well, you listening to us are entitled to your own opinion on it. You can guess what mine is. But there's another bit of...
Dave, it's interesting. Even a couple of our shows, our community radio shows, the Wisdom Table, we had a couple of physicians that were on there that were talking about approaches and ways to mitigate the pandemic, and two of them got shut down by YouTube. Even though they weren't crazy anti-government, they weren't crazy anti-vaccine, but they weren't in alignment with apparently whatever the policy that the feds were pushing out, and got shut down. So, how do you modulate that?
And I want to leave that to our listeners, because I have no more understanding than anyone else on what's right or wrong in something like this. But one thing I know is that we now have 5 years of evidence. We can look back and see that, among other things, the key medical people were half wrong in what they were recommending.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, it looks like, and they now have lots of data and big studies, wearing masks cut down the deaths of COVID somewhat, perhaps 10%. But the campaign to get people to wear masks,
it was dramatic. It was like, it's over 50%. I mean, that was kind of the implication of the campaign. Yeah.
That certainly was something you could infer from the way it was put.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out they were partly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the anti-vax people are picking up every error that Tony Fauci made.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I happen to have met Tony Fauci and watched him in public for almost 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
He's as honest and reputable as anybody in the public sphere that I followed. And he probably got this part wrong, as the best scientist always will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're human and they make mistakes.
Yeah.
The amount of information they have is very limited. And we had people dying, so many dying, that there was a refrigerated truck a few blocks away from me just for the bodies coming out of St. Luke's Hospital.
Same here, Dave. So, they had to make a call. In some cases, they got it wrong. In some cases, they got it right. But Dave, we got to take a break. We're talking about free speech and open speech on the internet, and whether or not and how that should be regulated. This Community of Technology, Dave Burstein and Stu Reid on WHCR 90.3 FM. We'll be right back after a brief musical break.
I don't know where my man is. Where can he be? What is he doing? I've been asking questions all over town. Where is he? Where can he be? Hoping he can be found. I'm on the loose, and I don't dig it. Take my advice. If you find a man, don't hold on. Don't let him. If you want him, don't let him. Hold on. Him tight. Know where my man is. Where can he be? What is he doing? I've been looking, searching, hunting, asking questions all over town. Where can he be? Where can he be? Hoping he can be found. Take my advice. If you find a man, go
Community Technology, Dave Burstein and Stu Reid. Dave, there's some other things going on in technology, in particular with the electric technology and electric cars. China seems to be taking the lead on that. What's the latest?
China is way ahead. Tesla, Musk is huge in China, almost bigger in China than in the US, but fell behind some of the Chinese companies as well. But the interesting thing for us is the prices in China. They just came out with a $16,000 car. It's a small car, doesn't have much range and so on. But when you look at China and the United States, it looks like Chinese prices are so much lower, which they are, that if we allowed in Chinese imports, the price of cars in the United States would go down something like $5,000.
Wow.
Stu, how important is that?
I think it's hugely important, Dave. As a consumer, I think that'd be a fabulous thing to see that happen. It's a global economy, and you got global manufacturers making this stuff. And, I think folks around the world should benefit from these kind of advances in technology. You're talking about all electric cars that are coming from China. Good for the environment. That's the way that we're trying to go. The government here is trying to incentivize the auto industry to move over to all electric. But on the other side, I know there's a lot of talk about tariffs and pushback and protecting the U.S. auto industry. To me, that sounds a little bit crazy. To have to protect these incredibly large corporate giants from competition. But essentially, in my mind, that's what the tariff conversation is all about. And at the end of the day, I think what it does, it drives up prices for the imports for the consumer. So
does every tariff, and there's a whole lot being imposed and a whole lot more probably coming. Certainly Trump has said he's going to have prohibitive tariffs. The US is basically forbidding import of Chinese cars. The European Union is looking at the same thing, and they've been putting tariffs between 10 and 40% on the Chinese cars because it's that much cheaper than the European cars that are no better.
Wow.
And is this right or wrong? I don't think it's crazy. I think it's probably a mistake, but it's not crazy to say I don't know how many 100,000 or million auto workers, many of whom would lose their jobs if the Chinese cars were let in and took a big part of the market. Is that right or wrong? Well, I don't think it's crazy to put that consideration in there, even if you're not sympathetic with Stellantis, who owns Chrysler, and the other giant automakers. But it's a live issue.
Yeah, Dave, just to me, I'm kind of stepping back and looking at it more just kind of conceptually. It just seems like selective capitalism. In the U.S. Economy, okay, it's every man, every company for themselves, dog eat dog. If I can make a better widget cheaper, I'm going to dominate the market. But then if somebody else that doesn't look like us or doesn't live here wants to do the same thing, they're prohibited. I mean, it's it's protectionistic, and it protects the U.S. industry. But again, as the world economy globalizes, and I think we're there already, I think some of those barriers got to be broken down. I don't know how you do that without hurting the U.S. industry. But if it's all about competition and capitalism, come on, how can we have it both ways?
5 years ago, 9 out of 10 economists would have agreed with you. Most of the other 10 were people on the left who wanted to protect labor, including the economists who worked for the labor unions, and obviously the corporate types.
Mm-hmm.
But the economists were pretty sure they knew what was right or wrong. They were absolutely sure, most of them, that in the long run, free trade, as they called it, would be beneficial. And you just have to do some cleanup along the way to make sure that the people who lose their jobs are protected and taken care of. That's a big issue with what's going to happen with artificial intelligence, which is, well, as we've reported here again and again, getting better and better and definitely going to destroy a lot of jobs. One of the surprises is they're not like automation going to factories. They're affecting things like computer programmers, where the AI software really is able to save at least 10 and possibly as much as 30% of the work in programming, according to programmers who are much better than I am. And it's improving. But 8 years ago, a Harvard professor, whose name I'm forgetting, did a very influential paper that looked at how severe the impact was on people in the United States of all the imports being let in. And he looked at something that you could see almost, you certainly can visualize it, what was happening in what was called the Rust Belt. That parts of the country, including the Midwest, US Steel, General Motors, and so on, were being hurt so badly and so fast that the effect on America of letting in the imports wasn't so clearly beneficial as all the economists thought. And since then, a lot of economists have gone along with that. I don't know the answers.
Yeah.
But I know that it's a huge problem. Couple of other things to look at while we're on electric vehicles in China and the United States. In the US, the government is spending a pile of money. One of the stories we have is that 100,000 new electric vehicle chargers are happening every week, and $2 million or so was given by the federal government to Ann Arbor to put in chargers.
This is chargers for electric cars, equivalent of gas stations.
Yeah, which is one of the ways that the United States tries to encourage people to buy electric cars.
Right.
And for the last year, it's been failing miserably.
Really?
Sales
Failing how you talking about the sales of electric cars?
Gone down heavily.
Have gone down. Really?
Yeah, Tesla sales themselves were down. And I think the overall number of electric cars sold in the United States also was down a little bit. It's certainly not growing, as everybody campaigning for electric cars to reduce climate problems have been upsetting. Now, the Chinese have the opposite for two reasons. And one of them is something that is a deep ideological divide. In China, the government decided they wanted less pollution. Their efforts in China are definitely ahead of the United States in terms of amount of solar power being put in and things like that. The Chinese government, a number of years ago, saw pollution and climate change as a huge problem and said, we're going to do something about it. So they directed the companies in China what to do, which to a certain extent the Chinese government can do, although it's far from absolute. And in fact, they have pulled ahead in electric vehicles, and why it's flat or declining in the United States, and I assume similarly in Europe, it is growing very rapidly in China. I think 35% of the cars sold last year in China were electric, and it's starting to make a big difference. Do you remember a few years ago when we had those news stories about how terrible the air was in Beijing?
I remember that. I remember that, Dave.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I remember
And
that.
it was true.
I
And the
remember.
Americans,
I think the big stories during the Olympics that were over there a few years ago. They had all kind of crazy pictures of the air quality. Wow. So
absolutely.
changed up,
And
huh?
among other things, as I recall, the American ambassador to China, as the American ambassador to India is doing now, because they haven't solved the problem, sent his kids to the United States to boarding school because he didn't want them growing up in the polluted air of Beijing.
Hmm.
Guess what? Beijing's air now, 5 years later, has a minimal pollution problem.
That's a pretty quick turnaround, Dave. That's pretty stunning.
And they had to do some very serious stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They put a system where, depending on what your license plate was, you couldn't drive for half the week, forcing people to take public transit, which they have superb in Beijing, and drive less.
Right. You can never legislate that over here. People would have a heart attack.
Well, we did that in the
during the World War II. Okay.
We also did it in 73 during the Israeli-Arab War. When it's a side bit of that, we had the gas crisis.
Yeah, well, they regulated the fuel consumption. They didn't regulate driving. I mean, to me, that's, Americans look on that as like a First Amendment right, Dave. That's my interpretation of how Americans think about it.
Well, they don't have a First Amendment in China. They have a government whose policy, and they say it again and again, is to follow the lead of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party is doing things that China needs to get ahead, including going to electric cars. That's one reason China is ahead. The second reason is that their auto market and most of their markets, including artificial intelligence, is far more competitive than the supposedly capitalist country, the United States.
Wait, Dave, you're saying within China, there is a competitive auto market within the country?
Far more competitive than the American auto market.
Wow,
and I'm watching China in terms of the technology, not particularly autos, but it's really dramatic. There are about 8 big companies spending everything they can to move over to electricity under government direction, but also under competition. And in fact, as I say, the prices are $5,000 on average less in the US. I may be underestimating that. And that's because there has been a price war in China with 8 companies all looking for market share, so severe that Tesla's worldwide sales went down. And in China in particular, they had to cut prices. That's the way competition is supposed to work. The Chinese, under Deng, now 40 years ago, realized that competition, when it was strong, could work really well. And they have an economy that in most areas is far more competitive than the United States. I've seen it right now. I just got an article about the price of storage in data centers in the US. Hasn't gone down in 4 years, despite them getting much more productive. I haven't researched whether the guy got it right or wrong, but that's certainly quite possible. Because in the United States, the author said there, and it makes sense, there are basically 3 companies that dominate the business: Google, Microsoft, and Apple.
Okay.
No, Amazon.
Amazon probably. Right.
AWS.
Yeah.
And when you have three companies, you're not in
That's
a
not
strongly
competition, right?
competitive market.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of competition, but it's much weaker competition than we are seeing right now in China, where they have 8 companies desperately looking for market share.
Mm-hmm.
Because they know 3 of them are going to go broke in 5 years, and they don't want to be that one.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, Dave. When I'm, just kind of looking at the so-called communist slash socialist company in some ways is more capitalist driven than the capitalist country, at least in some industries. Mm-hmm.
In some ways, on the other hand, a third or a half of Chinese industry is still controlled by the government. The phone companies, for example. But the China are controlled, 60% owned by the government. But the Chinese are so convinced that competition is a good thing, even though they own all 3 companies, they have been competing pretty hard for the last 10 or 20 years. And the state appointed heads of those companies know that keeping their job depends on them growing their company and bringing down prices and acting like they would if there was strong competition. And it's plus or minus with the 3 there. But the basic thing, and we've seen it, and I've seen it very closely, is when with the cable versus the telco and broadband, which I've reported for 20 years, de facto, they're looking at each other, not having to meet in the back room of airport motels, as often happened in conspiracies to fix prices, and say, it wouldn't be smart for us to cut the price because the other guy would just cut it. In fact, the head of a phone company once said to me, didn't do it, but he said the smart thing for us to do probably would be to get with the cable company and both raise prices, as has happened for the last 20 years in the United States. They didn't get together. As a friend of mine, who was a vice president in a company that owned some of the biggest cable franchises in the city, in the world, in the country rather, told me, we've gotten so good at signaling each other. That's where I got the one I just gave you. We don't have to meet in back rooms in order to do it. We very publicly say things like, our plan in the next year is not to go for market share, but to go improve our bottom line and get better profits for our shareholders. So when the head of Bell Canada, which is one I happen to know worked just like that, said something like that on Wall Street, is that illegal? Is that breaking the antitrust laws?
Probably not, Dave, but he's sending a signal and he's telling folks what his pricing strategy is. So, I mean, you have a de facto collusion without actual collusion. So, that's
I've
how it
watched,
goes. Mm-hmm.
I've watched really closely
Mm-hmm.
the United States phone and cable companies for 20 years, and that's how it usually works.
Yeah.
Doesn't always work. It fell apart. Well, it didn't fell apart, but got seriously affected about 8 years ago when AT&T and Verizon got too greedy in the mobile phone industry. So they came on so aggressively in marketing that T-Mobile US was afraid of going bust, as Sprint gave up and sold out to T-Mobile because it was doing terribly. So T-Mobile broke with the de facto cartel of 4 companies, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile, and became the uncarrier and did bring down prices and broke away from the cartel. And that's what, that's why economists can come up with any conclusion they want on this issue, because there are examples both ways.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, until you get up to 5 and 8 companies, competition tends to be pretty weak.
Okay, let's bring it back home, Dave. That's the big picture of what's going on globally. I want to talk about something a little more mundane and that might resonate somewhat with our listeners. And that is the whole issue of right to repair in electronics. Going back many decades, Dave, I can recall, that I used to tinker around electronics with my soldering gun and fix this, that, and the other. And of course, stuff has gotten much more sophisticated over the decades. And even though I don't have the skills to repair and fix a lot of this stuff, other people do. And the manufacturers have historically, electronic manufacturers, discouraged that. In fact, they even say you open up, you touch the inside of the stuff, you void the warranty. So there's been a big push, consumer advocates, and in fact, last December in New York became the first state in the country to require electronic device manufacturers to make their repair materials available to the public with a right to repair law. And then more recently, in July, Minnesota and California also came up with similar legislation. And Oregon and Colorado are expected to follow soon. So, one of the big issues here is not just, the tinkerers like I used to be, but one of the big overarching issues is, a culture of digital disposability. Stuff breaks and we just throw it away and go buy a new one. And of course, that works really well for the manufacturers because, every couple of years, you got to buy a new device. You got to buy a new
And
computer.
when we're
You gotta
talking
buy a new
about
phone.
a $50,000 electric car, how does it apply there?
Well, one of my family members, my sister, has a Prius, and she's a little over 100,000 miles, and thank God it's held up. But we have read, when the battery dies in that thing, it's a hybrid, it's going to be something like $20,000 to replace it. So
I don't know the hybrids, but on the all-electric cars like Tesla, it is like $20,000 and $30,000 to replace the battery. And batteries, like the one in my cell phone, do die over time.
yeah.
That's for 2 reasons. One is that it's a huge battery for electric car, so there's much more to replace. And the other is no one does or could make a replacement battery for a Tesla, which would have to meet a whole lot of very strict requirements. So Tesla has a monopoly and can charge what they want.
Yeah.
They apparently were charging more for a replacement battery than for a new car.
Wow.
Now, let's talk about practical things to do with it. One, you should know that if you're not buying new, you have to be very careful with electric cars because they could have a brutally expensive battery problem. As you said, your sister's going perfectly well for 100,000 miles, and most people do, but that's part of it. And I wanted to put into this story Consumer Reports, which is buying cars themselves, paying for it at the dealer in order to test them, has a good team doing solid testing of the cars, and has 1 million subscribers that they survey for what cars are most reliable. They've been doing this for 70 years or so.
Right.
The piece of it that I wanted to bring is that you had to buy this magazine or subscribe to it to get some of the information. But I just noticed, checking out this story, that Consumer Reports has their list of the 10 most reliable used cars in the United States on the web that you can go check out.
Does that include electric cars, Dave?
No electric car came close to that list.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. But that's
Disappointing.
because very few electric cars in the United States have been around long enough.
That's true. Okay. Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. But definitely, I want Consumer Reports is so it's not perfect. I've certainly caught them in some errors over the
No,
years,
but at
and
least they're looking, and I'm thinking that they don't have the same incentive that a lot of the car magazines do. They are funded by advertising from the car manufacturers, so at least they have the some semblance of independence. But Dave, we're about out of time, Dave. We're the clock
I
is
got a
ticking
last
on us.
story.
Okay, what's the
Let me
kicker,
get
Dave?
there.
You got a kicker.
Practical. We like to give practical advice. And I just saw a survey that surprised me, but thinking about it, I'm sure was right. If you want to earn a living with computers and programming them, the best languages to learn are Python, JavaScript, and Java. Behind that is C and SQL. And that all makes sense. And I can add to it, Python has been coming on really strong in the last few years because it's easy and works well. But Stu, what would you guess the first-rate artificial intelligence guy said was the most important language to use?
Well, I'm not really guessing, Dave, because I took a look at your story, but I'm still amazed. I'm shocked. That's English. I mean, how does that work? How does that work, Dave?
One of the most important things in artificial intelligence that's really starting to work well is helping and sometimes replacing programmers.
Hmm.
So we now have software that I could say, I want an app to run for iPhones that allows people to look up free shopping sites for their next car. Compute, and it should be this and this and this.
Mhm.
Computer, write it for me.
Wow.
And the software now can write something that is usually 90% correct and sometimes 100% correct.
Hmm.
And that is getting better very, very fast.
Wow.
So if you want to control computers, English is the
You
coming
heard it here.
language.
AI and English replacing computer programming.
I think it was
Right.
Andrej Karpathy that I first
Yeah.
heard that from.
Okay, Dave, we got to wrap it up there. That's quite a stunning piece of information. This has been Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid on WHCR 90.3 FM and on the web at WHCR.org every Wednesday, Dave, Wednesdays from 5
You
to 6
wish
p.m.
it was Friday.
I wish it was Friday. Yeah, okay. So thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Stay tuned every week on WHCR 90.3 FM. Community and Technology. Just might learn something. Good night.